Picture this: across the globe, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, completely isolated human cultures have described the exact same ultimate reality. This isn't a myth, and it isn't a coincidence. It's actually one of the most profound historical mysteries of our time, a phenomenon that literally challenges the very foundation of how we understand consciousness, history, and the divine.
For centuries, there's been this absolutely profound tension at the heart of human spirituality. On one side, we have these rigid institutional frameworks that demand unquestioning belief in a very specific set of historical claims. But on the other side, there's an ancient, cross-cultural invitation to something entirely different: direct experience. Think about it this way. One path asks for belief, which produces a population that agrees. The other path asks for disciplined practice, producing a population that has actually looked for themselves.
Section 1. The Mystery of Convergence.
In biology, when completely isolated species, like vertebrates and cephalopods, independently evolve the exact same solution, like the camera eye, scientists treat it as powerful evidence that the solution reflects a universal truth about physics and light. Well, we're going to apply that exact same standard of evidence to spiritual history. Because when you survey the historical record, a staggering statistical improbability emerges. We find over a dozen major, completely independent contemplative traditions. We have zero documented direct contact between their key originators, and yet they all produced one remarkably consistent, structurally identical description of an ineffable divine source. Human cultures with entire oceans and millennia separating them somehow arrived at the exact same cosmic address.
Just look at the timeline. In 3rd century Alexandria, you've got Plotinus describing an undifferentiated source he called the One. 500 years later in India, with absolutely no access to Plotinus, by the way, Adi Shankara formalizes Advaita Vedanta, describing Brahman in nearly identical terms as a single, undivided ground of being. Ibn Arabi writes of the unity of being, Kabbalists describe Ayin Sulf, the Tao Te Ching speaks of the unnameable Tao, and within Christianity itself, mystics wrote of the divine darkness. We're talking about figures separated by oceans, independently detailing a reality where the individual ego completely dissolves into a single underlying source. It's fascinating.
Section 2. Two Paths to the Divine.
So humanity has essentially engineered two distinct pathways to understand this divine reality: the doctrine-first institutional path and the experience-first perennial path. Institutional religion mediates your access to the divine through clergy, dogma, and strict authority. It's largely exclusivist, claiming to hold the sole valid revelation, and it usually views human nature as inherently flawed, requiring some kind of external rescue. But the perennial path, it offers you direct access through contemplative practice. It's totally convergent, recognizing that many traditions point to one shared reality, and instead of focusing on inherited flaws, it views human nature as containing an inherent divine spark. The whole goal isn't rescue, it's awakening.
A really striking difference also pops up in how these two paths view the feminine. While official institutional doctrines historically marginalized or just outright erased female divine figures, the perennial path consistently restores the sacred feminine. Whether we're talking about Sophia, Shakti, the Great Mother, or the Shekinah, the direct experience model naturally recognizes a balanced whole cosmology that institutional gatekeepers frequently tried to hide away.
Section 3. The Historical Record.
Now, if the perennial path is so universal, how did the institutional framework become the dominant force in the Western world? Well, to answer that, we have to do a rigorous historical audit. The doctrines that billions of people treat today as fixed, untouched divine transmissions, they were actually heavily negotiated, edited, voted on, and enforced by political forces. In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, mostly for political stabilization. Then he convenes the Council of Nicaea in 325. For over 2 centuries, ecclesiastical authorities argued over what to include and what to ban. The canon wasn't just handed down whole from the heavens, it was pieced together by committees of men with very real, vested political interests.
And the wild part is, we know exactly what they chose to leave out. In 1945, the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt completely flipped the institutional narrative upside down. Unearthing suppressed manuscripts like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary proved beyond a doubt that early spiritual thought was incredibly diverse. And more importantly, these buried texts were remarkably aligned with the perennial direct experience model. They weren't lost by accident, folks. They were systematically excluded by an institution that was actively consolidating its power.
And when persuasion failed, state power stepped in. The medieval Inquisition, the brutal witch trials, the 1493 Papal Bull that literally justified colonialism, and the Recuramento, which were forced legal readings demanding the immediate submission of indigenous peoples. These aren't just dark, isolated chapters of history. They're the heavily documented methods used to enforce doctrinal agreement through coercion and violence rather than through open philosophical inquiry.
Section 4. What institutions got right?
Okay, but a rigorous historical audit demands absolute honesty, which means we absolutely have to acknowledge where institutional religion succeeded. It's historically undeniable that these massive institutional structures provided irreplaceable social value. We can be highly confident that despite their doctrinal flaws, it was these centralized religions that built the world's first global network of hospitals, universities, orphanages, and disaster relief systems. They gave hundreds of millions of people a stable ethical vocabulary and a safety net of community support that no decentralized, free-flowing spiritual movement has ever been able to match at that kind of scale.
And remarkably, these massive institutions inadvertently became the incubators for some of history's greatest mystics, figures like Meister Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and the Desert Fathers. They actually preserved genuine contemplative technologies, and they survived right inside the very institutions that frequently didn't understand them and, in some cases, actively prosecuted them for heresy. In a weird twist of fate, the rigid institutional shell actually protected the mystical pearl.
Section 5. Answering the skeptics.
If we're going to stand here and claim that independent mystical experiences point to a fundamental reality, we've got to confront the strongest scientific and psychological objections head-on. The most serious scientific pushback is this. What if spiritual convergence is just biology? What if our brains, because we all share the same evolutionary hardware, are just hardwired to generate the exact same mystical hallucinations, regardless of whether those visions reflect any actual universal truth?
This is the domain of the cognitive science of religion. Researchers like Pascal Boyer argue that features like hyperactive agency detection, which is basically our brain's evolutionary tendency to assume an invisible intelligence is behind rustling leaves in the dark, explain why we invent gods in the first place. And honestly, it's a super compelling counterargument. But the perennial path pushes back forcefully here. The highly specific, intricately layered cosmology of mystical convergence, the precise descriptions of a non-dual ground reached through negation, the exact mechanics of the ego dissolving, it all goes far, far beyond what a generic evolutionary glitch or a simple cognitive bias would predict. The blueprints just match up way too perfectly to only be a biological coincidence.
The second major objection is purely practical. Without the rigid rules of institutional structure, doesn't spirituality just evolve into chaos, cults, and charlatans? And, well, history shows us that decentralized spiritual movements do severely lack accountability. This vacuum has undeniably led to documented misconduct, financial exploitation, and some pretty toxic guru culture.
But the perennial philosophy actually has a built-in defense mechanism against all this chaos. It's called reproducibility. Instead of relying on a single charismatic leader or a localized cult of personality, the ultimate standard of truth becomes reproducibility across independent traditions. You cross-check personal experience against the massive, historically verified convergent tradition. So if a modern guru claims something that violently contradicts the independent findings of thousands of mystics over thousands of years, the data points strongly to the guru being wrong.
Section 6. The final invitation.
Ultimately, when you look at the sheer weight of the evidence across biology, history, and theology, it comes down to a choice between two frameworks. On one side, you have institutional religion. It offers mediated access, makes exclusive claims, and relies on canons that were heavily shaped by political contingency and enforced by state power. On the other side, you have the perennial path. It offers direct access, was historically persecuted for its discoveries, yet presents convergent, independently verified truth claims that span across entirely unconnected cultures throughout all of human history.
So we're going to leave you with this final, profound thought to consider. You were not asked to blindly believe a story about the divine. You were offered by over a dozen completely unconnected civilizations the exact same set of directions back to it. Reading those directions and taking the journey yourself is, of course, entirely optional. But looking at the overwhelming evidence of convergence across human history, pretending those directions don't all point the exact same way is no longer an option.